Senator Williams, before we take this important vote, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind. You cite the oath of office that officers take. Would that also include the oath of office that the police chiefs of this state take?
I presume
I assume you would honor our police chiefs in their oath of office and to uphold their duties in the Constitution of the state of Texas and the United States. I hold in my hand, and I don't know if you've seen it, and I didn't have the pleasure of the opportunity to serve on your committee, but you do know I chair criminal justice and work very, very closely with law enforcement and rely upon them for their advice and counsel on most criminal justice matters. Are you familiar with my working relationship with law enforcement?
I am.
Being a very good and productive
one. I served with your vice chair my first session in the Senate.
I have in my hand a letter from the San Antonio Police Chief, and his letter is signed by the Austin Police Chief, Fort Worth, El Paso, and then I'm certain you've seen the comments by the Houston Police Chief.
I have.
Where they're very, very opposed to your legislation. So if you didn't have the opportunity to serve on the committee, like myself, other members, how would you reconcile your comments that it is such a good tool for law enforcement when the police chiefs of our major metropolitan cities are asking us to oppose your legislation? Would it not seem reasonable, just based on, in all due respect, your experience in law enforcement and public safety versus these outstanding police chiefs? Would it not make sense for me to listen to their advice and counsel over your recommendation?
And Senator Whitmire, I don't have any doubt that you're going to take their counsel. I think there's an honest disagreement between my committee and the people who want to advance this type of legislation, and some, but not all, of the police chiefs. And so I respect your opinion as I respect theirs, but I respectfully disagree with their reasoning about why this would be a problem.
Can you give this body a name of a police chief that would support your position?
Well, Senator Whitmire, what I can tell you is that
any just one. It doesn't have to be a major city.
The policy that we're attempting to adopt here, I can tell you what other cities that I'm aware of in the state that have similar policies, if you'll hang on just a second.
I was particularly interested in the police chiefs of any Texas city or town.
Well, I think if it's the policy of that city, it would be consistent with what the police chief wanted to do.
Well, maybe not.
Yeah, and so
I've got in my hand the major city police chiefs of Austin, San Antonio, El Paso, Fort Worth, and Houston, which would certainly make up a huge majority of our residents, asking us to kill this legislation because it will actually interfere with carrying out their duties and providing public safety. Does this not...
The city of Arlington, arrest and fingerprints and photographs, they essentially follow the policy that we're lining out here. Corpus Christi says if there's a violation of the law and they make an arrest, they follow this same policy. And so there are cities that have different policies, and that's actually the purpose of this legislation, is to bring a uniform policy to the state that would allow police officers to understand what they can and can't do. And what I want to be clear about, and what I think these respectfully, where I would part company with some of these police chiefs, we're not requiring the officers to make an inquiry, which is when these folks came to testify, that was what their testimony was, that they don't want to be required to do this. What we're saying in this bill is you can't have a policy that prohibits the inquiry. And so I think that there's a big misunderstanding about this, and I think that politically it's a very highly charged issue, and as I mentioned at the beginning, and I think maybe some of those police chiefs are responding to the political pressures that they might feel from the mayor or from city council.
Well, obviously, you're speculating why they sent me this letter.
We had several hours of
The letter,
testimony.
Tommy, was dated June 10th, so this is not on the old version. This is directed at our debate today. And they were very familiar with the terms. And I would also, when you mentioned Corpus and Arlington, that they would fingerprint and do a check on those arrested, you are familiar that that is the current policy in the city of Houston and Harris counties. They currently do arrest people. Those who go to jail at the county or the city are fingerprinted,
Well, I would
checked, and referred to ICE if, in fact, they're undocumented. What you're dealing with is not at the jail level. You're talking about a street cop.
Actually, Senator Whitmire, I would correct the statement that you just made. The city of Houston, their municipal jail, they do not do secure communities, as you just stated they did.
Okay.
They do not do that.
Strike the old practice of doing it at the city now because the city jail is so inadequate. You are correct. They will arrest someone, hold them, and then they are booked and kept at Harris County.
So what this legislation does, if someone is lawfully detained, it allows an officer, should someone not be able to present identification, to make an inquiry about that person's status if it can't be verified in any other way.
And before I address that practice, an element of the Houston police chief in opposing this, not only does he believe, according to his comments, it would interfere with public safety, it would be an unfounded mandate. Would you not agree with the police chief from Houston that it's going to cost approximately $4 million to train his 5,000 officers to follow the legislative intent of your legislation?
I do not agree with that.
Well, why would you be more familiar and correct about that than the person in charge of the department?
I think the police chief is making his comments that they're politically motivated, that he's under pressure from the mayor and from city council to make these statements.
Well, obviously, I think, and I know you wouldn't intend to question his integrity or his intent.
I'm not. But I disagree that it's going to cost them $4 million.
Well, I think most reasonable people would go with the police chief. Have you ever run a police department?
No, I have not.
Now, you're saying you're not requiring it, but you can't prohibit under your legislation the questioning of someone that an officer pulls over. Can I go to the next step? If he or she pulls someone over and through your legislation allows them to inquire as to their citizenship, if they find the person is not a citizen or cannot prove his or her citizenship, what would your legislation anticipate the next step would be?
There is no requirement that they do anything.
But what would a reasonable person think, or what will the policy be next if, in fact, he or she cannot prove their citizenship and their own Washington Avenue in Houston, they pulled over, they can't prove it. Now what would you anticipate, or what are the perhaps unintended consequences, Senator Williams, to that person and his or her family that would be in the car?
Senator Whitmire, it is left to the discretion of the officer. There is no requirement that any further action be taken one way or the other.
Well, I think we need to concern ourselves with that because that is a real-life circumstance. If an officer chooses, would your legislation allow the officer to apprehend, to arrest someone that cannot prove their citizenship?
Only if there was probable cause for another offense. It wouldn't allow an officer of a state or municipal government to make an arrest for someone being in the country unlawfully. They could refer to that person to the federal authorities, to ICE.
Not there on the street, I assume. So to refer that person to ICE, is it your legislative intent that he, the officer, or she, the officer, arrest that individual, take them to jail? Or is it your legislative intent that they cannot be arrested solely because they cannot produce papers proving that they are U.S. citizens?
Senator Whitmire, there is no basis under state law for someone to be arrested because they're in this country illegally. I would think you, of all people, would know about that. There is no basis for
I
arrest.
understand, but you're proposing a very, very new concept in police work that police chiefs themselves oppose. So I'm trying to get your legislative intent. It's not your intent that someone who cannot prove his or her citizenship to be arrested and taken to jail for the purposes of determining citizenship.
There is no requirement under this bill that that be done. It would be left to the discretion of the officer. What I would say, Senator Whitmire, is that I can't imagine a circumstance, a lawful circumstance, where a police officer had, there would have to be probable cause for some other offense before they could even make this inquiry. I can't imagine a lawful circumstance where this inquiry would be made without some probable cause, some event, whether it's a traffic violation or whatever it might be. There would be no reason or basis for an officer to make such an inquiry until they had probable cause.
Okay, real life example. Someone turns left illegally, middle of the afternoon. Female operator of the vehicle. She turns left. Officer sees it, pulls her over. Today he most likely would write her a traffic citation. If during this traffic citation, if he chooses under your legislation to ask citizenship papers and she cannot produce it, what would your legislation anticipate?
Senator Whitmire, if in the circumstance that you just gave, if someone had a valid Texas driver's license, their lawful presence in the United States would be presumed by that driver's license, and there would be no need for the officer to even inquire about their citizenship status. It would be, there'd be no reason. He would just write the ticket and let her go on. There would be no other reason.
What about this real life example? What if she in fact cannot prove through a valid driver's license? And in fact, I'll even say, what if she's undocumented? Undocumented, minding her own business, 3 children at home. By the way, she owns her home, pays taxes, but she's not a citizen. And she turns left, officer stops her. She cannot produce papers because she's undocumented. What would you anticipate the officer's next action?
I think it would be, if someone does not have a valid Texas driver's license and they can't produce any form of identification, I think the officer may, if they so choose, make an inquiry about how that person is here. And so it's up to that officer to decide. This legislation does not require the officer to take any action one way or the other. It would be left to the discretion.
You know what? I trust you, Tommy, in that is probably where you say I've done my job in setting up a standard for Texas cities. Does it not concern you about the unintended consequences of your legislation?
It does not.
Meaning you are giving officers the tools and the opportunity to use that left turn illegally in the middle of the afternoon as a reason to apprehend and arrest that woman for being in this country illegally. And the unintended consequences would be, because
Senator
obviously she's
Whitmire,
violating law. The unintended consequences is she's got to pick up 3 kids at the end of the school day.
Senator Whitmire,
she will have a house of children without a grown-up in it. Does it not concern you that your legislation will implement a policy of checking citizenship, which will lead to the unintended consequences of mothers and fathers being split from their children because they're going to be apprehended and taken to jail and not being there to pick up the children and take them home?
Senator Whitmire, there is no basis for a police officer in the state of Texas to make an arrest of that woman because she's undocumented. There is no basis for that.
But are
There
you,
would have to be some other reason for him to make an arrest.
well, she turned left illegally. That's the reason
is
she
that
has an
something that
encounter
you
with
would
the police.
arrest her for?
And Lord knows I wish she wouldn't have made that turn, and she for sure wishes she had not.
Well, would
But
that be
mistakes are
something?
made, and then that leads to the citizenship inquiry, which leads her to go to jail and not be with her children that evening.
I think that's a pretty big leap, Senator Whitmire.
I'm going to, later when I speak against this bill, I'm going to actually cite you the case and those circumstances. Now, before I sit down for this period of the discussion, let me ask you about border security. I understand the interaction of police departments in the interior, Houston, where you and I reside or serve. You're actually proud to be from the Woodlands. How does this help me understand this legislation as it relates to border security in terms of the concern that you have over the cartel criminal activity, perhaps human trafficking? How in the world is it going to create circumstances that would stop people from crossing at the border?
Well, Senator Whitmire, that would be a federal responsibility to stop those people from crossing illegally at the border. There are three components to this bill, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, and I think each one of those plays an important part in this whole thing. One would be the Secure Communities Program, which is in effect in all 254 counties in our state. Unfortunately, there is a loophole that some cities are availing themselves of, that if they're not booking in the county jail, they're bonding people out without checking their identity, and that's led to some unfortunate circumstances like the death of the police officer that we heard about just a couple of weeks ago in our home community. And also, I think it's important that we understand that someone be in our country, that they have a lawful presence. That same person who ran over the police officer had a valid Texas driver's license that he obtained before these rules went into effect. And so that person had something which most people would consider to be evidence that they're here legally if they have a document issued by the state of Texas, like a driver's license, that is assumed to be and should be a secure form of identification. I think all of those things are important. And as I said in my remarks, and maybe you watched in committee and maybe you didn't, I'm less concerned about the people who are economic refugees. That's less who I'm interested in with this bill. I am concerned that people who want to come here and make a contribution, that they should be given an opportunity to do that. Unfortunately, that is an issue that we cannot address at the state level. It is the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government, and their failure to come up with a reasonable immigration policy has put a lot of these people in a very bad situation.
But you are
and a lot of Americans.
You are familiar now, Senator Williams. Before you take up this legislation, you cannot get a valid Texas driver's license without proof of citizenship. So if you're trying to fix that problem, it's already fixed.
Currently, there are rules in place that would allow that. There is a lawsuit that's pending now that's attempting to get those rules thrown out. Part of what we're doing in this bill is we're giving the department the statutory authority to enact those rules that 47 other states and soon 49 other states will have enacted.
So that's been fixed. You cannot get a valid Texas license without proven citizenship. You mentioned the tragedies in Houston.
I wouldn't say that it's been fixed. It's been addressed.
You can't go down today and renew your driver's license. In fact, there's thousands of folks working in this state with a Texas valid driver's license that are not going to be able to renew it because they cannot prove their citizenship. So that is a policy that's been addressed. The tragedy of Officer Johnson's, who would have testified before your committee, I was at the funeral. It was a terrible tragedy. But the person that shot him, you are familiar, had already been deported twice. And so would you not agree with, if someone is committed to crime and are criminals, your legislation is not going to deter them? This person had already crossed the border, and you are correct. We have a border security issue. But stopping a person of his nature in Houston through a policy of enforcement would not have prevented that criminal, if he's committed to murdering a police officer.
Senator Whitmire.
How would your legislation have stopped someone that is so committed to crime? And the gentleman, the person that ran over the officer the other night, you're saying he was released, but that was before the current policy of fingerprinting and checking with ICE as to see that they're an undocumented resident. I'm just concerned, Senator Williams, that as you fight the criminal element, that no law is going to deter a committed cartel member. My concern is, and I will have a dialogue with you later this evening, about the unintended consequences on many thousands of law-abiding, church-going, family value people that find themselves here, and the unintended consequence of your legislation is going to separate families and incarcerate people that, quite frankly, came to this country when we had an open border and open arms for their talents and their values that they brought to our state.
Thank you, Senator Whitmire. I look forward to that exchange.